Welcome to Dollars and Dwellings. I'm Patrick Diamond.
And I'm Ralph DiBugnara. Welcome to our podcast. Welcome back to episode 3 of Dollars and Dwellings. I'm Ralph DiBugnara. This is Patrick Diamond, and we're here to talk about everything real estate and finance and how it's affecting you and your world.
All right, so I'm going to take us through a quick little recap from episode 2. 1 and 2, we were doing a deep dive into buying your first primary residence. Episode 2, there were a couple topics on financing we wanted to circle back on, like VA loans, which was a good one. And then we talked a little bit about how escrow works and your loan servicer works. We talked a little bit about the importance of record keeping. And then we had a good conversation around buying new construction versus a fixer-upper and kind of everything that goes into that. So if those topics interest you and you haven't checked out episode 2, then please go back and give that a listen. So before we get into today's hot topic, you just got back from a trip to Italy.
Yes.
You might notice Ralph's looking nice and tan, and I'm not.
A lot of walking around in the sun.
I'm not tan. Did you have a good trip?
It was great. Yeah, it was amazing. It was a tourist trip, but I went back to see my family that I've never met before in a small town outside of Rome. So it was amazing.
Did you look at any properties there?
I didn't look at properties. I asked a lot of questions about the cost of properties and what it costs to live there. And it's interesting because now I kind of see why people retire to other countries a lot of the time. It's a lot more affordable.
Did you stay in hotels or Airbnb? Or?
I stayed in hotels. I stayed in one Airbnb and then stayed in hotels outside of that. It's an expensive time to travel to Europe, which is a whole different conversation around real estate because people are really traveling internationally right now and not domestically. But I stayed in mostly hotels.
I typically like staying in hotels. I stay in Airbnbs when I'm on, like I did a surf trip to California, and like you need a place to keep your surfboard and to dry your wetsuit.
Yeah.
And like hotels are not conducive to that. So Airbnbs are perfect, like a place with a backyard.
As an Airbnb owner, it's mostly people who are going on longer trips, who have kids or dogs, or like I have a place in horse country. They want to put their horse trailers in so there's usually a reason around it. It's not just hey, I prefer this to hotels. It's usually a specific reason around it.
Yeah, and I asked you about your trip because I saw an article recently about the fact that here in our market there's been I guess a lesser amount of international buyers in the U.S. market. And I guess that's been something that's been going on for a few years. I guess mainly related to the strength of the U.S. dollar, which means it's a bad time for them to buy here, but a good time for us to potentially buy internationally.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the cost of homes, there isn't a housing crisis in most of these countries as far as the inventory shortages, because they can still build in most of these, depending. I mean, if you're going to live in major cities, it's always going to be expensive. But outside of that, you could definitely see why people would move out of the country. It's just a lot more affordable. But my family's town, which was outside of Rome, which is a small town, but you could live there very comfortably with a mortgage and everything else for like between $1,200 and $1,500 a month with all your expenses included. And and my brother went to Calabria, which is really beach. Same thing there. Mm-hmm. Like very affordably can live in these places. So it's interesting to think of.
Every time I travel, like internationally on a surf trip, I'm always like, oh, why don't I live here? But then I realized I could never live internationally.
You couldn't go that route.
I couldn't go that route. All right, so again, episodes 1 and 2 were about buying your primary residence. But like we keep talking about, it's a bit of a crazy market. So if you can't buy currently, then your other decision is renting. So we thought it would be sort of a natural segue into an episode on renting your apartment, which I think is useful if you're someone who's looking to rent, or maybe somebody like you who has purchased an investment property and you now are faced with the task of finding tenants.
Sure.
I think this conversation could be useful for both of those situations. I guess let's just kind of talk about the pros and cons of renting. I mean, I've been a long time renter in New York City. We rented an apartment together. So if you watched episode 1, you know that Ralph and I have known each other for a long time. and we lived together for a couple of years.
Yeah, a nice place.
Yeah, a nice place down in the financial district in Lower Manhattan. But it was a unique time down there because they were converting.
It was post 9/11. It was post 9/11.
Right. So that neighborhood was kind of not really residential.
No, we got a deal.
Yeah.
It was expensive still, but we got a deal for the time period, and it was
a weird market down there. So they'd done some. Our building was new construction, but there were also a lot of like office conversions going on down there at the time.
But in retrospect, I left it kind of after the market crash, the real estate market crash. So I didn't have the means at the time. But in retrospect, if I was to rent anything now, and even thinking back to renting then, I would rent in a place that I was purposely renting to do research. Now, so if I was thinking along those lines of the financial district at the time we were renting, we probably could have made a killing on buying a place down there at that time, because the market had really just been breaking onto the residential side of the business. It was really a commercial office space neighborhood, and now it became very residential. And if we would have bought there, we would have done very well. So if you're going to rent, my suggestion is to try to rent in a place that you wish to buy at some point, or you think you wish to buy at some point. Because if you view it that way, getting to know the blocks, getting to know the neighborhoods, getting to know what's going kind of what place you're transitioning, will let you make a very educated decision when you're ready to buy on where is the right place to buy and what is the right place to buy. So if we would have thought along those lines, it would have really worked out for us, but we weren't in that mind space.
Nor was my liquidity in that mind space. True. I had just gotten out of law school, so I was starting to make good money at my law firm, but yeah, I was a little I was not exactly liquid to be purchasing real estate at the time. But it was that was a great building when we first moved into it. Yeah. We were on the 47th floor. Yeah. I still remember the apartment number, 4701.
Yeah.
Yeah, we thought we were kings of the world.
Yeah, I mean,
back then.
Again, there's pros and cons. There's pros and cons to renting. If you're gonna, and I don't look at it as a waste of money because of the experience I got out of it, but if you're looking to save money, having expensive rent is not the probably way to go to buy. But I also think that, again,
well, it's why we lived together, because
that's true.
It was the rent it was a 2-bedroom apartment, but split between 2 people. That rent for Manhattan was actually pretty reasonable.
It really was, if you think back on it now.
Yeah.
I don't know what that place would be today. Probably $6,000-$7,000 a month.
I don't even want to think about it. But it also probably isn't as nice as it was.
That's true.
I'm pretty sure by the time I got out of that building, it already wasn't as nice as when we moved into it. But you make a good point. I mean, renting with a purpose. Rent with a purpose. It could be more affordable. For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Have you come across rent-to-own situations?
Less than you used to. They still exist. In hot real estate markets, you're not going to see as much of that because sellers don't need to do that. Mm-hmm. There are some situations where neighborhoods are transitioning, where there's city or state-run programs that go in there for people to rent to own. It's like you'll see some of those. Mm-hmm. But you'll in a hot real estate market like we're in right now, where it's to the seller's advantage, you see less and less of that. In a buyer's market, you see a lot of that. Yeah. In a seller's market, not so much.
To me, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because also, like, the process of renting an apartment, at least in my experience, is ridiculous, right? Like, you see the apartment like once, maybe twice, and you're like, yeah, I'll live here for at least a year. Like, you have no idea, like, you really have no idea.
You bought in.
Noise levels at night or, on weekends. But
along those terms, along you saying that too, what's become very, very popular over the last couple of years is midterm rentals.
What's that?
So a midterm rental is something that's over 30 days but less than 12 months. So it could be 90 days, 120 days, 6 months. You usually don't see midterm rentals longer than 6 months, but it's a good way to kind of get into a property and not have to commit the same way you would before. And Airbnb and VRBO offer good options to say, hey, I want to rent for a certain amount of time and see how I like the neighborhood. I won't rent to anybody on Airbnb or VRBO over 29 days.
Okay. Because
over 30 days in most states, squatter laws kick in, and I don't want to ever go down that road.
Yeah, you have a story about that.
Yeah, definitely.
We should come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But, so midterm rentals are a good way to kind of get to know a place and not completely commit, and you're seeing more and more landlords go towards that. You may pay more of a premium for that to not signing a year lease, but it's a good tool.
Huh. Do you rent any of your places furnished?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah,
okay.
So besides the Airbnb, VRBO properties, which obviously are furnished, I use a couple of different sites that kind of offer midterm rentals. The one that's very popular is something called Furnished Finders. And Furnished Finders was really originally only meant for traveling nurses and doctors, but since there's less traveling nurses and doctors now than there was a couple of years ago, they've kind of opened it up to more people. Yeah. And that's people who are looking to stay over 30 days, and those are furnished. So
Okay.
it just depends on the place. I mean, most of the places that I rent furnished are properties that I will use for a short-term rental like Airbnb.
Yeah, I've never rented a furnished
Furnished
apartment.
places.
I don't know why.
You'll see that corporate housing. You'll see a lot of that sometimes that people.
Corporate housing, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it goes on.
All right. I mean, that's a great segue into you've owned rental properties as an investment for a long time. Let's talk about what you look for in a good tenant, and the process you go through. So whether you're looking to rent yourself or if you're looking for tenants, maybe
Yeah.
this will be a little bit informative.
I mean, I use services like apartments.com is something I use, which is pretty good, that they'll run a credit and a background check on the potential renter. I like to sit down and meet with them one-on-one, no matter what, before I rent the property to them. So it's almost like an interview process.
I've had landlords, like you expect some questionnaire to fill out, some application to fill out, but I mean, I've had landlords ask me for like backup on my entire net worth, and I'm just like, are you crazy?
They'll go
I'm
that-
not
I mean,
buying this house.
I will ask for pay stubs to prove at least what they're making.
Right.
And credit checks, obviously, because I want to see that they have some kind of payment history. I'm not necessarily hyper focused on credit scores, because I know that, and we'll get into that at some point, where credit scores don't make sense sometimes, but I want to see if they're paying their bills on time, and if they have collections and judgments and bankruptcies and stuff like that. So that's stuff I'm looking for. But friend referrals are tough a lot of the time. I've had some problems with friend referrals before.
Okay.
Because you never really know what you're getting. That person doesn't know what the person's living habits are. So I try to do my best to vet them as much as I possibly can without making it ridiculous.
Uh-huh. And I guess it's safe to say when you're looking to buy a rental property as an investment, you're looking for properties that are going to be attractive to renters.
For sure.
So like close to or close to public transportation, maybe, or safe, secure parking.
Yeah, I mean, listen, work from home has kind of changed that around a little bit. So transportation is as important as it used to be, but parking is usually important depending on where you're renting. What I found with any kind of rentals is that the better the area that you own the home, usually the better kind of rental you're getting, the less wear and tear will be on the house. Because if there's stuff for them to do around, if there's parks, if there's grocery stores, if there's stuff like that, it's a better experience for them. They kind of know what they're getting involved in and where they're moving to.
Yeah.
If there's not, then there tends to be more wear and tear in the house, and you get less of a value tenant.
Okay.
That's they're just looking for any place to live, and they sometimes treat the house that way.
What's your pet policy as a landlord?
I don't allow pets with long-term rentals at this point. I have a no pet policy. It's funny because on my short-term rentals I do.
Yeah.
The reasoning behind that is that
Wear and tear.
wear and tear.
Yeah.
And I've had some horror stories with pets, whereas they've destroyed houses, carpet, floors, that kind of stuff. So, I would be open to it with some kind of security deposit specifically for the pet, but it makes it more difficult to rent a property with a pet for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's very hard to rent a property, in my experience and in my friend's experience, if you have a large dog.
Yes.
It's
almost impossible.
Almost impossible.
Yes.
So keep that in mind. If you're a large dog owner, you're going to have a hell of a time finding an apartment, or you're going to pay through the nose in some kind
Just
of
to do it, correct.
it's a
It's
pet
going to pay
fee.
a premium for a pet fee, definitely.
Yeah. All right, circling back to kind of on when you do your due diligence on a potential tenant, let's get into the nitty gritty a little bit on financials. Rent to income is kind of I kind of use that as like the rent equivalent of debt to income when you're looking to purchase a home. Are you still looking at those same types of metrics?
I would like that the rent is no more than 50% of their gross income, not their net, so their before taxes income.
Okay.
If it's 50% or less, I'm usually okay with renting to them. Because 50% or less is essentially probably 80% of their income, but it's a reasonable enough number based off of bank qualifications that I think is reasonable. So I'm essentially looking at that their income be 50%, their rent is no more than 50% of their gross income.
Okay. So I make $100,000 a year. Let's say if I make $100,000 a year, basically the rent should, on an annual basis, should be less than $50,000, basically.
Correct.
Just to use round numbers.
For sure. Yeah. Correct. Exactly.
Yeah. When you're renting, there's also, I forget what the magic number is, like 40 times your income,
Yeah.
like there's like kind of like that like
That formula.
shortcut rule of like
Yeah, I mean,
income should be 40 times the
in larger
monthly
luxury
rent.
buildings, they'll use those numbers. I think I have to be a little bit more reasonable when I get my tenant. I'm much more concerned of who I'm getting rather than that they have a certain amount of reserves compared to their. I mean, the problem with rental, just so you know, and it's important to know the rental for a landlord. It's important to really, really know the rental laws and how and when you can get these people out, because that could be the biggest problem you ever faced in your career as an investor, right? As like not being, I know people who have gone years in New York and New Jersey without being able to get tenants out who aren't paying rent. So it's important that you have a high quality renter rather than the income's not going to save you if they don't want to pay rent. They can still lose their job.
Yeah. It's funny, I always consider myself like a high quality tenant.
Yeah.
In all my years as an apartment renter, and but yet I think only once have I ever had a landlord who actually appreciated the fact that like I was a really good tenant.
You're underappreciated.
Underappreciated, totally. So that was my life lesson. There's the concept of guarantors sometimes when you're renting, and that's usually when if your financials don't meet the criteria to be a rental candidate, you can bring on a guarantor. A lot of times you see it when you're like with young professionals, you're just starting out after college, you want to rent an apartment, maybe you don't have the income for it, but a parent could sign on as a guarantor for your lease. Do you allow that? Or
I have in the past. Yeah, I don't have too many of those right now, but I have in the past. You know, I think the biggest thing, no matter who, whether it's that person or the guarantor, whatever it is, I think the clear thing is that if we get into a situation where you're not paying your rent and I'm owed money, I'm going to file it as a collection against your credit report, which you can do at some point. And I think that's the fear as a renter. If you don't think you're going to be able to, if you can't afford the rent at any point during the process, trust me, just get with the landlord and try to work something out, because in a lot of states, you know, the laws play to your favor, so they're going to want to work with you on it. Like whether it's reducing it or like, hey, I'll give you a month to get out or whatever it is, right? So I think at this point, which is why I run credit and background, they want to make sure they haven't had any issues in the past as far as owing rent.
Yeah.
There's a lot more public record on the stuff now at this point, and for my purposes, I want to be able to possibly file a collection on it if they owe me money.
Okay, I mean that's good advice. I think I've rented in apartment buildings exclusively, but you know, I've had sort of like big corporate property managers who like you don't ever hear from ever, and you can't find them when there's a problem.
Sure.
But then I've also rented from an owner who was a very hands-on landlord who was talking to me all the time. Thankfully, she was really nice, and I thought that was we had a very good landlord-tenant relationship. Are you in more contact with your tenants or less?
That's a good question. So I have a property manager for a few of those properties at this point, the larger multifamily ones. And for me, 3 families is as big as I go, but I do have a property manager to deal with that stuff on a daily basis. On the short-term rentals, unfortunately for my wife, she handles the bookings, and so she's in communication more with that stuff. I'm more kind of dealing with the maintenance and the top line of it. But yeah, I mean, for the Airbnb stuff, we're in constant contact, obviously. Right. For the longer-term rentals, I try to check in at least once a quarter myself, personally, even with the property manager being there. I try to at least check in with myself once a quarter, like, hey, how's it going? Because you could have a property manager that's not answering phone calls, and you won't know it unless you check in yourself.
Right.
So that could be a problem.
Yeah. And so you mentioned earlier, sort of squatters' rights. You had a situation where, was it a property you just hadn't checked on in a while, or because a couple of things here. So it was a property that I rented to somebody who worked for a family member. What I didn't know is this person was no longer working for my family member at this point now, and they were bringing people in from out of the country, and they were setting them up with the attorney to get citizenship and all that stuff. But while they were doing all that process, he was charging them to live in my house without your knowledge.
Without my knowledge. It became such a big business for him that he put bunk beds in the dining room. So I hadn't been in the house. The person I had managing the property at the time wasn't checking in. And I ended up getting a call from the building department.
So you had a property manager.
Yeah.
And they were asleep at the wheel.
They were in this situation. They were asleep at the wheel. Yes. Yeah. And they may have just been hiding it well, but they were asleep at the wheel. And so the building department eventually reached out to me because I guess what had happened is there was a complaint by the neighbor that there was a significant amount of garbage on the side of the house. So they come to knock on the door. They're like, we have to check the house. They come in, there's like this bunk beds in this freaking house.
Right.
And by the way, the tenant didn't have to let them in, but they did.
Uh-huh.
They let them in. They checked the house. He calls me. He's like, hey, I've been looking for you. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, you know, you have 9 people living in your house right now. So long story short is I went there the next day with the building department to meet with the tenant. At that point, he realized it wasn't me running. He thought it was me originally running a business out of the house, like I was renting.
Right.
He realized at this point it's not me, it's the tenant.
Classic story of you just playing dumb. Oh, it wasn't me.
Yeah.
No, it really wasn't.
But it wasn't
you.
me in the situation. He's like, look, my best advice to you is that you can't tell them to leave because they have squatters' rights at this point. He's like, you can ask them to leave and hope that they do. So that's what I did. I was like, look, you got to get the house down to just the people who are on the lease at this point. Now everybody else has got to go. And he did that. And then I was like, if you do that, I'll let you stay till I won't file an eviction notice. I'll let you stay till the end of your lease. So I essentially had to bargain with my own house to get them to. So that's kind of where we are right now. And this is his last month in the house. So hopefully.
Wow. But you never had to do eviction proceedings, which
I have in other properties before, before COVID, and that took in New York, it took a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lawyer, but thankfully I've never had to deal with.
And I have properties in Florida where I have to do it too, and Florida's like immediate. In New York, it's a long process. So it's important to know the state, the city, and what your eviction process is in that situation, because in New York specifically, it's really a tenant-friendly state.
Right.
And
so if you're a tenant, that's good.
Yeah,
You're a landlord,
not so good.
Not so good.
But yeah, it takes a long time to get people out in certain states.
Yeah. All right. That is a crazy story. I remember you telling it to me when it
it's not what was going on.
I was like, wow. So pretty typical when you're renting. You know, you usually have to come up with a bank check for the first month's rent, possibly the last month's rent, and a security deposit, which can be a pretty significant financial outlay.
For sure.
If you have no savings.
No, it could
it's
be
like
a down payment on a house, to be honest with you.
Right. And you might be hiring movers, and maybe buying some furniture. So like, you know, there could be, some pretty good upfront costs.
For sure.
When renting. So just, if you've never rented before, just know that going into it, that you do kind of need to save up for those upfront costs. Do you typically assess those?
Yeah. For people coming in, so I'm gonna take security first month and sometimes last, depending on the place. By the way, and your landlord, if you are a renter, is supposed to keep that money in a separate interest-bearing account that they're supposed to show you proof of that the money's there for security deposit. Because the last thing you want to do is get to the end of your process and you think you're getting a security deposit back and the landlord doesn't have the funds to give it to you. So make sure that money's in a separate account because it's supposed to be.
Right. Which is a great segue into reading your actual lease.
Correct, yeah.
We talked a little bit about reading documents in episode 2 around a purchase, but the same thing goes for when you're leasing. I mean, it reminds me back to when we lived together in Lower Manhattan. At some point when we renewed the lease, there was an addendum to it or a rider to it that talked about like construction noise. And I remember like I was just like, oh, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
and they were putting a building up next door, weren't they?
They built a second tower,
That's right.
basically attached to our building, and all of a sudden, 1 week at 7 a.m. there's no, not even jackhammer. It was pile driving. They were pile driving the foundation of the new tower, and that went on. I think that went on until
you left.
I moved out.
That's not a quick process.
Not a quick process, no. And at least in New York City, 7 a.m. on the dot, they start. So that it was in the lease renewal. I was tipped off to it, but I didn't pay attention to it. I learned that lesson the hard way. But there's a lot of important things in your lease, like the keeping your deposit separate.
Correct,
should be in there. The landlord's ability to enter the apartment with notice.
Yeah, a landlord shouldn't just be able to show up to your apartment and walk in.
Right.
For sure. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely a set appointment that they're supposed to come in on. They can't just show up and say, I'm coming in.
Yeah.
You have a lot of rights by renting that house at that point.
Yeah, and no one wants to read a lease agreement. It's like reading your cell phone contract. Yes. But I would say it's very important. And you want to keep a copy, just like we talked about the importance of record keeping. You want to keep a copy of that lease someplace safe in case you do ever need to revisit it. All right. Have you ever had renter's insurance?
I don't don't think I
Or do
have.
you require renter insurance from your renters? Because I've had landlords require
I
it.
don't, and you may want to. I don't, and it's a really, really good question. It's probably something I should be looking into.
I think I've actually only ever had one. I moved into a new building. It was actually up in Westchester County when I was working up there, and that was the only place that actually required
it, huh?
But it's very inexpensive.
It's probably worth it just in case anything happens. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, it's typically very inexpensive. It covers the cost to repair or replace your property should something happen, if a pipe bursts or the tenant below you starts a fire, which, I mean, I've definitely lived in buildings where I've had to evacuate due to smoke and fire alarms. But I think it's so inexpensive, it's worth having, especially if you have the cost of renter's insurance will vary depending upon the cost.
I know people whose houses burned down that they were renting it and they didn't have any insurance on. Like, it's definitely it's an insignificant enough cost that if you have anything valuable there, and especially if you have a car, something like that, it may be worth it for you to have it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good. We'll probably come back to this in a later episode, but if you're a landlord, you need special landlord insurance.
Correct.
You just can't have regular homeowners insurance if you're a landlord. But if you're a renter, you should entertain the idea of renter's insurance. It will also cover the cost of a hotel if for some reason you have to something happens in the building, you have to leave, and you need to rent a hotel room. Your renter's insurance will likely pick up the cost of renting a hotel. I think that we ran through my renting outline pretty quickly.
Listen, renting is a necessary evil for a lot of us for a lot of the time, and I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. I don't think it's a great investment, but at the same time, you could use it as a tool to what you're going to invest later on, right?
Oh, that's a great point. We keep hitting on this concept of exit strategies with properties, but there's, you often hear when you're making the decision between owning and renting, like the calculation you should be doing to determine whether one is more cost effective versus the other. And I know there's typically sort of this 5-year rule that if you're not going to live in a house for at least 5 years, you really ought to consider renting. It's more economical.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it could be a situation where, especially depending on what you're paying for the house, that it makes more sense to rent. I have a hard time, and again, I'm in mortgages my whole life, so don't take it from me completely, but I have a hard time spending money every month that I don't think is going anywhere to pay down a debt that's going to eventually create equity or interest for me in my pocket at some point. So I'm just programmed at this point.
I think I'm the flip side of that. Like I've rented and I own a house, and like I see sometimes what a pain in the ass owning a house can be with upkeep and problems and pest control and things. And I'm like, oh man, I miss my renting days where like the toilet's not flushing, you just call.
Yeah, you call somebody to do it for you.
You call somebody and they take care of it. But anyway, hopefully this, if you're either in the situation of looking to rent or looking to bring on a tenant, hopefully some of the things we covered in this episode
will help. Yeah,
will help. So thanks for tuning in. We look forward to talking more in future episodes. So yeah, thank you.
If you have any questions or comments, leave them with us and we'll get back to you on it as well. Thanks again.
Yeah, I'm Patrick.
I'm Ralph.
All right, talk to you soon. This is your co-host, Patrick Diamond. I'm a vice president and certified financial planner with Wealth Management Resources in Smithfield, Rhode Island, where I serve our investment customers as an investment advisor representative. My co-host is Ralph DiBagnera. Ralph serves as president of Home Qualified, the digital resource for buyers, sellers, and real estate agents. He's also vice president at Cardinal Financial, a nationally recognized mortgage loan company, and he's the recent author of The Growth Trap, a continuous plan to avoid the traps of life and build a better you. Our discussion is not tied to the offer or sale of any investment products or products in general. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not meant to be legal, tax, or investment advice.